For centuries, Europeans slept with a fear that came from the sea. A silent coastline, a quiet monastery, a fishing village, and it could suddenly explode into terror as longships emerged from the mist. Who were these people? Why did they appear so suddenly, and how did they end up changing the political, cultural, and military landscape of Europe forever? Did they come to burn and steal, or to conquer and settle? And how did their wars shape kingdoms like England, France, Ireland, Scotland, Kiev and Rus, and even the Byzantine Empire? In this video, we're going to dive deep into the Viking Wars, what caused them, how they unfolded, who the major players were, and how Europe would never be the same again because of them. So without any delay, let's start. To understand the Viking Wars, we first need to understand the world the Vikings came from. The term Vikings refers not to a single tribe, but a collection of Scandinavian peoples primarily from what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their homeland was rugged, mountainous, and cold. Farming was difficult, resources were limited, and population growth put pressure on the land. Scandinavian society valued independence, exploration, trade, honor, and above all wealth. So naturally, young warriors looked outward. The sea wasn't a barrier to them, it was a map of possibilities. Their ships, long, narrow, flexible, and fast, were technological masterpieces. They allowed them to cross open oceans, navigate rivers, land on shallow beaches, and escape quickly before resistance could build. This mobility made them unpredictable, and unpredictability is the greatest weapon in war. But economic pressure wasn't the only reason they expanded. Scandinavian political culture was changing. Chieftains and small kings competed fiercely for power and prestige. To keep followers loyal, leaders needed treasure, slaves, land, and connections. Raiding provided all of that. Meanwhile, Europe outside Scandinavia seemed tempting. The Carolingian Empire, ruled by Charlemagne and later his grandsons, was wealthy but politically strained. England was divided into competing kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia. Ireland had no unified ruler and was dominated by rival clans. In other words, Europe was rich and divided. The Vikings noticed. The official beginning of the Viking Age is often marked by a single event in 793 AD, the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England. It wasn't the first Viking raid, but it shocked the Christian world. Monasteries were not just religious centers, they were banks, libraries, administrative offices, and symbols of divine authority. The attack was brutal, unexpected, and deeply symbolic. Word spread quickly, and fear followed. To Europeans, the Vikings seemed like a punishment sent by God. But to the Vikings, it was simple: they found a vulnerable target, and they took advantage. Over the next decades, Viking raids spread along the coasts of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. At first, they were seasonal hit-and-run attacks. Longships landed, warriors stormed villages, took valuables, slaves, livestock, and then vanished into the sea. But gradually, raid turned into occupation. They began building winter camps, known as overwintering bases, which allowed them to operate year-round. Suddenly, Europe realized this was no longer a coastal problem, it was a continental one. Ireland was among the earliest regions heavily affected. Viking forces raided monasteries like Kells and Clonmacnoise, but soon they began establishing settlements. The city of Dublin, today the capital of Ireland, began as a Viking trading base in 841. From there, the Norse developed networks of trade, taxation, and local alliances. Irish kings fought each other almost as much as they fought the Vikings. In many cases, Vikings served as mercenaries, influencing regional politics. So even where they didn't conquer outright, they reshaped power structures. Meanwhile, in England, the Viking threat escalated dramatically in 865 with the arrival of the Great Heathen army, a coalition of warriors whose goal was not raiding, but conquest. Led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, and Halfdan Ragnarsson, often said to be sons of the semi-mythical hero, Ragnar Lothbrok the army systematically invaded English kingdoms. Northumbria fell, East Anglia fell, Mercia fell. Only Wessex remained, ruled by a young king named Alfred. England's fate rested on him. Alfred the Great understood something others didn't. Fighting Vikings required new strategies. He built fortified towns called burhs, created a navy to challenge longships, reorganized the army so it could fight year-round, and reformed taxation to sustain long-term warfare. The turning point came in 878, at the Battle of Edington, where Alfred defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. Instead of executing him, Alfred negotiated. Guthrum converted to Christianity and retreated north. This led to the creation of the Danelaw, a vast region of England under Viking rule, where Scandinavian law, language, customs, and settlements took root. England no longer belonged entirely to the English. The Vikings were now part of it. Across the English Channel, Viking attacks devastated Francia. Charlemagne tried to defend the coast, but even he struggled. After his death, his empire fractured into competing kingdoms. Viking fleets sailed up major rivers like the Seine, Loire, and Rhine, bypassing coastal defenses and striking the heart of the empire. In 845, a Viking army led by Ragnar, at least according to some chronicles, sailed up the Seine and attacked Paris. The Frankish king paid an enormous ransom to make them leave. This became a pattern Vikings realized Europeans would pay to avoid destruction. Raiding became big business. Yet resistance grew, and a new solution emerged, one that would transform European history. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple granted land in northern France to a Viking leader named Rollo in exchange for protection and loyalty. This region became Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. Over time, the Vikings there adopted Christianity, intermarried, learned French, and became powerful lords. But they did not forget their warrior tradition. Their descendants would one day invade England, conquer Sicily, enter the Mediterranean, and even challenge the Byzantine Empire. The story of the Viking Wars didn't end with settlement, it expanded. But while the Vikings gained power in Western Europe, a different drama was unfolding in the East. Swedish Vikings known as Varangians traveled through the rivers of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They traded, raided, and sometimes ruled Slavic communities along trade routes connecting the Baltic and the Byzantine Empire. According to the primary chronicle, a Varangian leader named Rurik founded the dynasty that would become Kievan Rus. Whether legendary or historical, what matters is that Scandinavian influence shaped the early state that later evolved into Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Viking leaders like Oleg and Igor launched campaigns against Constantinople, demanding trade rights and tribute. The Byzantines, impressed by Viking strength, eventually recruited them instead of fighting them. This led to the creation of the Varangian Guard, an elite palace guard loyal only to the emperor. Armed with giant axes and fierce reputations, they became symbols of loyalty and brutality. Even here, far from Scandinavia, Viking warfare changed history. At this point, Europe was no longer just reacting to Viking attacks, it was transforming because of them. Kingdoms had to modernize, centralize, build defenses, create taxation systems, and organize armies in new ways. In other words, Viking violence unintentionally encouraged European state-building. They didn't just destroy, they forced evolution. As the raids intensified, European societies were forced to adapt. On the British Isles, monasteries began fortifying their walls. River towns started building watchtowers. Kings who had once been rivals suddenly realized they needed unity more than land or crowns. No place understood this better than England. When the great Heathen army landed in 865, it was not a quick strike. It was a war of domination. City after city fell: York, Nottingham, Reading. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, divided by old borders and ancient rivalries, struggled to mount a collective response. Wessex alone remained unconquered. And it was there that one of history's most important figures emerged: Alfred. Later known as Alfred the Great, Alfred understood that fighting Vikings required more than courage, it required strategy. Instead of chasing raiding bands across the countryside, he built a network of fortified towns called burhs. He reorganized the army, rotating troops so fields could still be farmed and soldiers stayed ready year-round. He even invested in a navy, recognizing that control of the sea meant control over Viking nobility. For the first time, the invaders found themselves restrained, slowed, forced to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore in 878, dividing England between Alfred's Wessex and Viking-controlled Danelaw. Many kings would have been satisfied with survival. Alfred, however, envisioned something greater in England united. And though he did not live to see it, his foundations ultimately paved the way for a single English kingdom, ruled by his descendants. Meanwhile, across the Channel, another transformation was unfolding, one of the most unexpected in medieval history. A Viking leader named Rollo besieged Paris repeatedly, nearly starving the city. The Franks could not drive him out. So instead, in 911, King Charles the Simple offered him something revolutionary: land, legitimacy, and nobility in exchange for loyalty and defense. Rollo accepted, converting to Christianity, taking the name Robert, and becoming the first Duke of Normandy. This moment changed Europe forever. The Northmen who settled in Normandy did not simply disappear. They merged with local cultures, intermarried, adopted French language and customs, and transformed into a new people, the Normans. Their descendants would build castles across Europe, conquer southern Italy, challenge the Byzantine Empire, and in 1066, under William the Conqueror, invade and forever reshape England. Thus, the Viking Wars did not end in a single battle or treaty. They ended in assimilation, where conquerors became rulers, settlers, and eventually kings. But the Viking Age was not only a story of war. It was also a story of exploration and connectivity. From Scandinavia, longships sailed west to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus. Archaeological evidence from El Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirms what Norse sagas long suggested. Vikings reached the New World. They did not stay, but their journey remains a remarkable symbol of human daring and curiosity. To the east, Vikings known as Varangians sailed down the rivers of Russia, trading amber, furs, and slaves with Byzantine merchants. They founded trading hubs like Novgorod and Kyiv, eventually forming what would later become the Kiev and Rus state. Their descendants influenced the culture, politics, and identity of Eastern Europe. Some even served as elite mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire, the Varangian Guard, famous for their loyalty and ferocity on the battlefield. So why, after centuries of dominance, did the Viking Wars gradually fade? The answer lies in transformation, both in Europe and within Scandinavia itself. As kingdoms became more centralized, defenses improved, and coastlines were fortified, raiding became less profitable. Christianity spread throughout Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, changing values and political structures. Trade and diplomacy replaced plunder. A new era was emerging, one of kings, laws, and settled societies. By the late 11th century, the age of the longship had ended. But its legacy was impossible to erase. The Viking Wars reshaped Europe in lasting ways. They disrupted old kingdoms and created new ones. They forced rulers to build stronger militaries, governments, and economies. England, Normandy, Russia, none of these would exist in their familiar forms without Viking pressure. The very map of Europe was redrawn. Even culturally, the Vikings left fingerprints everywhere: language, genetics, place names, mythology, art, shipbuilding, and trade networks stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. What began as terror on the horizon ended as integration into the heart of European civilization. And perhaps that is the most compelling part of this story. History rarely gives us simple heroes or villains. The Vikings were raiders, but also traders. They brought destruction, but also innovation. They toppled kingdoms, but helped build new ones. Their wars were brutal, but their legacy outlived their battles. Today, their memory survives not only in sagas, museums, or ruins, But in everyday life in the English language, in political borders, in family names, in stories told across continents, the Viking Wars were not just conflicts of the past, they were catalysts for what Europe would become. And so, when we imagine a wooden longship slicing through cold ocean waters, a carved dragon staring toward an unknown shore, we are not only remembering warfare, we are remembering a turning point in world history. A moment when the North came south, when old systems collapsed, when Europe was forced to rebuild stronger than before. The Vikings did not conquer the world, but they changed it permanently.